Good afternoon, Tom.
Hey, everybody. If Mike's not around, it's going to feel a bit like the first time your parents left you alone in the house, isn't it?
We still got Todd.
Hello, folks.
Hey, Todd.
Sorry, I'm a tad late. Looks like we have a decent amount of people here already, so I guess I'll get started. I wanted to just update everyone on the tracking spec discussion, and I think a lot of people here have actually, I guess before we get started, I see a few new faces. Maybe we should do some intros. Feel free to raise your hand if you'd like to introduce yourself digitally or otherwise, but it's totally optional. Hey, Nicholas.
I'm Ivan. I'm also relatively new. I'm from Swisscom, working in Switzerland, and also just joining on these meetings to learn a bit more about OpenFeature, feature flag, and flag-D mainly. Yeah.
Hey, Ivan. I think you were here last time as well.
So
yeah. Okay. Yeah, we'll get started. Yeah, so I wanted to talk again about the tracking proposal. I think a few of you here have already participated in the discussion. But I'll add the link to the GitHub discussion that's been going pretty well, and I'll also put the link to the docs in the Zoom chat. Oh, somebody already did. Thank you, Ben. Basically, I'd say that TLDR in the discussion for the tracking has come down to basically a couple points. One is exactly the shape of these values, these metric values or values, however we want to call them. Essentially like a numeric value that we may want to make like a first class citizen to the tracking event API and to the probably the tracking payloads, at least from an API perspective. So I think we're pretty much moving towards consensus there that we need something like that. My opinion is probably just a single numeric value will do it. That's at least how it looks like the discussion is trending. The other two issues that are a little bit newer that I wanted to mention, there's been some discussion on how we're going to kind of do the provider lifecycle. We talked about that a little bit last week. I've had a few side conversations on how that might work. And after those, I'm kind of still of the opinion that maybe we want to just kind of optionally extend the provider interface to support tracking. But the background here is, say you have a SDK, a vendor SDK, or a solution that has some kind of tracking functionality like Launch Darkly or DevCycle or Split. They have some kind of tracking event to kind of signify a goal that a user has hit, perhaps as the endpoint of a feature flag related experiment. The there's obviously some SDK functionality in most of these cases, like a method corresponding to this. And therefore, our providers would need to have a method corresponding to this. However, lots of vendors and even our internal reference implementation backend flag don't support tracking. So we want some way of kind of mixing that functionality in or multiplexing it, like basically kind of having a tracking provider as well as a feature flag provider, or a way to patch that into providers. So I'm leaning more on the second, still, after some subsequent discussions from last meeting. And I think the main reason is, for me, it's just going to make implementation really easy. So, for example, if you were using Go feature flag, which I don't think supports any sort of tracking, you could just extend the Go feature flag provider and then implement the tracking method with segment or some other API or some other SDK, sorry. The other kind of option that people are trending towards is a dedicated set tracking provider. And like I said, that sounds fine. My only concern with that is that then how do we interface that with the lifecycle? Like, when are we ready to evaluate flags? Does it mean that both providers need to be ready? That sort of thing would shut down, I guess, shuts down both those providers. But it sounds more complicated to me. So I'm interested to see what other people think about that. That seems like a pretty fuzzy question at this point, to me, based on the discussion. And lastly, the last highlight I'll leave everyone with. There's been some talk about basically how we get, in some systems, how we get flag evaluations kind of imported into the track event, or whether or not that's necessary. So for a targeting key or a user that's identified with some kind of session or something, it's easy in some backend system to correlate, obviously, the feature flag events and your tracking event. But basically, some folks from eBay were saying that in their system, it would be helpful to be able to actually add feature flag evaluations to a tracking event. So you could, in the API itself, kind of say, these are the associated feature flag evaluations I cared about that were relevant, and actually kind of put them into the tracking event. So wondering whether or not we want first class support for that, and if anyone has any thoughts on that one. Those are kind of the remaining points that I've been kind of working on in that discussion. I don't know if anybody has any input on any of them here, but interested to hear if you do.
Does anyone, or you, Todd, do you have any concrete situations where, so I think it was like the second example you gave of there being like two separate providers, a flag provider and a tracking provider. You're talking about concerns about like life cycle triggers and stuff like that. Do you have a concrete example of where that might be problematic?
Yeah, I mean, it's not that it's like necessarily problematic as much as it is complex to implement. So, for example, say you have two separate providers, like let's just use the example of Go feature flag, and let's say you want to use segment. So you have a segment SDK and you have a Go feature flag SDK. Both of them might have to do some initialization. Both of them might maintain some persistent connections. Both of them do some authentication. So essentially there's like two initializations that need to happen. So when you set a feature flag provider, we do OpenFeature.setProvider, and you pass in the feature flag provider. We need, if we were going to go the kind of route we're describing with a separate dedicated tracking provider, you do something like OpenFeature set provider as well as OpenFeature set tracking provider. So then when both of those, well, right now, when one of those is done initializing and ready to go, we get a ready event from the SDK. Some of the blocking initializers stop blocking. So if you set both, do you wait for both? How do you know you're going to set both, right? Like, do you have to set them in a single method call? So it's like set provider with a tracking provider, which I don't know. I think the ergonomics of that is a little bit weird. And then what happens if you just update the one? Does the system go into a not ready state while it's initializing? So essentially, it's like we have two initialization life cycles to handle in that method. Whereas if we just kind of bundle them into a single object, it has a unified initialization that's taken care of in user land. That's the complexity I'm trying to get at, and there may be a solution to this complexity that's pretty elegant, but it doesn't seem as straightforward to me as like a single object.
Yeah, understood. That does sound like the worm can would potentially open there.
Yeah, I mean, so I think that one is, it's unclear to me how to move forward. It's like the biggest issue at this point. That's would stop me from kind of proposing anything in the spec. But if anybody has any creative ideas or wants to draw some out, totally up for that.
So Todd, just to phrase it in a different way, it's more a question of who has responsibility for initializing and managing and maintaining the tracking provider, right? Whether it's the OpenFeature SDK or the flag provider SDK. Is that a fair way of saying it in a different way?
Yeah, I guess that's a fair way to put it. Like, to put it like very similarly, I guess I would say, do we want to make kind of patching in tracking a user land concern for providers, or do we want to have basically SDK support for amalgamating tracking providers and feature flag providers? I think that's really what it comes down to. Yeah.
I mean, just thinking in terms of like user experience and ergonomics, being able to like do that at the open feature level would feel like a really like, I would be kind of cool to do that, but I tend to like, so Flagsmith leans on analytics integrations quite heavily, and they can be problematic. Like, I think if you were to, yeah, maybe the sort of common denominator stuff that the OpenFeature SDK is doing might not, can't think of specifics, but it would probably be tricky to have that work in the way that you would expect, like with it managing that tracking SDK. And then on a separate point, I think I would feel very strongly that flag state well, speaking from Flagsmith, would 100% want to be a first-class citizen. Like, most of the customers that we have that use the analytics integrations they rely on that flag state going into downstream to their analytics provider as like the core use case for using the providers in the first place. I think we've lost Todd. I don't know what anyone else thinks about that. That would seem, from our point of view, that would be like, yeah, flag state would be like 100%. Without that, I think the majority of our customers that have those integrations, they would be useless without the flag state coming, or some subset of the flag state coming into the provider, the tracking. Yeah.
So it will increase the ergonomic heavily to have that integrated in OpenFeature provider.
Well, I guess you don't have to send that stuff. Like, actually, the interesting is, so the way that Flagsmith works is, well, Flagsmith delegates this out into the API, which we can do obviously because it's all, it's all ours. And so when we set those integrations, they don't happen on the SDK, they happen in our API. But we send those flag states down to Segment or Heap or whoever. If you were to define that within the SDK, I guess you wouldn't have to you could define none, or you could define a subset flag names, or maybe all of them. So I guess you wouldn't have to if you didn't want to. But just in our experience of our customers, it's almost always not just relevant, but like vital that that information gets into the analytics data store. Otherwise, you can't. Like for A/B testing, you need that state. Otherwise, you don't have anything to segment on.
Yeah, I guess the real question is where should that passing of that state live, right? Because I think in a lot of existing platforms right now, like I'm sure Flagsmith and us, like we're currently providing sort of that context to those analytics providers, like as part of our SDKs. And the question is, do we sort of pull that up into the open feature spec or not? Is kind of the question. Like if you're using events with open feature, is now the expectation that metadata is now only handled through kind of the open feature layer, and you'd need to hook up all of your analytics integrations only through sort of like the open feature layer for this all to make sense, is kind of the question as I see it, which probably is the way long term, but it's like, what's the transition to that, right? Like what's the clear transition of like, all right, going from the current state where all that stuff's handled by the various like vendors to this new state.
Yeah, my kind of main goal here has always been not necessarily the most robust, mature analytics solution, but basically trying to remove the last big impedance mismatch between a lot of vendors that do tracking and open feature. So what we've heard specifically from a couple different customers, Split and LaunchDarkly are two that come to mind, who are using open feature, is that they still are really locked into those associated SDKs because they have to call the track method. And really all it would take for them to be able to kind of remove their direct surface area on the underlying SDKs completely is this track method, right? And because it's implemented so commonly in providers, that's really why we want to attack it. Like, I don't necessarily think that we need to have the most robust solution for analytics. Like we're at the end of the day, open feature is really about feature flagging, but experimentation is part of that, and therefore analytics is a part of it. But if you're doing robust experimentation all over and you're a segment customer, you're probably still going to have a segment SDK. Open feature is not going to replace segment, right? But it may replace calls to, so your specific vendor .track. I think that's the main priority. And so that's why I think I've been heading towards more conservative kind of implementations. Yeah. The person who messaged me and I was really keen to get their implementation because they're already using open feature with a different tracking solution, is eBay. So eBay is already doing this. They're pretty heavily invested in open feature. But the contact I had couldn't make the meeting today. So I'm going to be meeting with him later on in the week and see to understand a little bit better what they're doing. And see if they have any thoughts on this.
Wonder if, I mean, there's two fairly different things going on here, because there's the interfaces for tracking, native tracking, like in DevCycle, right, or LaunchDarkly, and then there's kind of like sort of almost like sidecar analytics integrations for like Flagsmith and Go Feature Flag and whatever, and FlagD, where they don't have native tracking. I wonder how different those two classes are. I think it might be a trap to consider them as the same or very similar.
That's possible. Yeah, that's possible. That's possibly true. I mean, I'll tip my hand that my native kind of my like, I guess, like open feature native solution would be some simple hotel events, so that You know, if you're using flag D, use the OTel hook. And you also have that we would implement this tracking method, and you'd send a very simple OTel event, which is just basically a structured log. And then in your backend, you could take the targeting key and see, okay, my targeting key for these evaluations was this and this, and I can see how that evaluated. And then my targeting key for this track event is this. I can see therefore that it's all the same user, and I can tell a story. It's pretty much that simple. But you know, yeah, that assumption might not hold for other platforms and other backends. But that was kind of my vision for a very open source, like cloud native kind of solution, I suppose. Anyway, yeah, I think there's still open questions here. I'll try and keep shepherding this discussion. I'm looking forward to hear what eBay's doing, because like I said, they already have a solution that works basically like we're talking about with a how did you put it, Ben? Like not an all-in-one solution, like an aggregate solution. So I'm interested to see what they're doing. If there's no other input there, I'll move on to the next point. This one should be fairly quick. We don't have anything in our spec about logging, specifically logging errors. So in every one of our implementations, there's like basically a loop, a flag evaluation, you know, part of the SDK that evaluates a flag. If something goes wrong, there's an exception, and that exception is caught, and then you know the error hooks fire, and those error hooks, you know, might do any kind of integration, mark spans as errors or whatever. Who knows what you're going to do? But there's this like central part where essentially there's a flag evaluation that attempts to take place. In most cases, it's in a try catch in languages where that's possible. And in some cases we log, and in some cases we don't. This is extremely inconsistent across all our SDKs. And I'm wondering if we need to say something about logging. Specifically, one of the things I was thinking is, do we need some kind of like top level configuration where you can say what kind of logging you want to do? Is just injecting your own logger good enough, and we always call log.error on it? We could also like have some kind of map where you map the types of errors you want to log. Specifically, this came about because different providers consider different things an error. So some people got really this happened in the OTel playground. Actually, they were surprised to see a whole bunch of errors for disabled flags with their particular implementation. And so yeah, the question is like, do we want to specify something here? Do we want to make some consistent configuration here? We're a library, so I don't think people like to see log spam. But on the other hand, when you're first getting things set up, it's really nice to see errors.
Yeah, it is. We've done this where we have exposed like a simplified logging interface so that people can integrate it into their internal logging system. Most languages have kind of standardized logging stuff anyway, so that is nice to have. I don't know if it's like a required thing to have on all the SDKs. I think we should be like kind of try to be clear about what we log, and we should try to be pretty conservative about what we log, I think. So like having some standardization across the SDKs of like we should log for this and not log, like maybe just do like a debug log for this that you can enable. But if we do get into that, I would recommend like opening up like some type of logging interface that people can pass in. That's just like a standard like info debug warning error style interface that people can override and implement.
I think we do have that in just about every implementation. Like we have SLF for J, which is basically an interface in Java. We have a very basic interface in JS. But the thing is, we're not consistently using them. So in some cases, we're doing logger.error, and in other cases, we're doing logger.debug, and in other cases, we're not calling it at all. So that's I think where there's the mismatch. I think Dominic had his hand up first, and then
I think Andre was first.
Okay, go ahead, Andre.
Okay, let's do a rock, paper, scissors to decide that. So actually, in relation to logging, I am going to speak again from a .NET perspective. So in relation to logging, for example, the hotel team did a nice thing that was, if you have a file into the bin folder on the project, it will generate like more extra logs. So, imagine that the connection is failing, imagine that multiple things happen, we were able to add that file and then log that in case we need extra, let's say, underneath logs, because when customers are trying to implement and then they fail and then they try to understand, no, but I follow everything and it's just a network stuff. I think those kind of logs are important and necessary. More about in terms of domain logs. What I mean by domain logs are how the flag is evaluated and how long it took the flag to evaluate, let's say. I believe that, again, in a .NET perspective, like there is the iLogger, and then you can attach those kind of events. And if you are expecting logs and you want to log, you just need to specify the source context in the config, and then everything is tied up. And that's from the .NET perspective. Now, in relation to standardization, I think it might make sense, especially, for example, imagine that you are a developer, you are in a startup, and then you need to jump between, let's say, .NET, and then you need to do something in iOS, then you need to do something in Android. Like, in the end, you want to have consistency, and I think it's that consistency that we should bring as a standard. There are perhaps the minimal logs that we should expect from the spec, but then might be extra logs that each library, each language implements. But again, I think there at least a minimum should be in the spec, so every single library has the same logs and the same structure. So that's my opinion.
Okay, Dominic.
+1 to Andra. I think having some structured log with some very limited but defined by the standard dictionary of kind of events logs could be very helpful, especially that we are often talking about distributed systems with many technologies. So to analyze those logs in the backend, it's better to have at least some basic structures and semantics. But it may be pretty challenging. Yeah.
Thomas. Oh, you're muted, Thomas.
Is it better now?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, sorry, wrong mic actually. I was wondering what we wanted to do with those logs. Like, is it only for the SDKs, or is it also some kind of logger we want to give to the providers too, where they can log things? And if it's also for the providers, I was wondering if it's really needed, because we have the events where, like, if we want to trigger errors or this kind of things, that is like pretty useful most of the time. And I was wondering if logs is still needed for providers actually. But yeah, more question.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, you can hook into the event system to do logging for sure. Yeah, and I agree with what's been said so far. I think the thing to highlight, I would say that a lot of the stuff that we're talking about already more or less exists, because we do use a lot of standard logging patterns. Like we use iLogger specifically, Andre, as you mentioned, for C#. We use basically essentially like an interface extraction of the JavaScript console and JavaScript that you can implement. It's compatible with like Winston or any of the popular loggers. We use SLF4J, which is basically an industry standard in Java. So we use all these, and you can structure them however you want. To your point, Dominic, like if you wanted to use like a structured logging, you can configure your SLF4J or to do that. So that's fine. I think the real question for me is like the actual in the SDKs. Yeah, some SDKs I don't think have this stuff, but in the actual SDKs, where do we want to log and at what level do we want to log? Like, for example, if there's an error during evaluation, should we log that? And what level should we log it at? Should we log it at error level? And then, I mean, if you've injected your logger, it will log. But the question is, does it make sense to do that by default? Should we be just logging at debug everything? Same for flag not found, right? Like that was this case in OTel. To Thomas's point, like they had disabled the flags, and then the system they were using, disabled flags don't appear, and they were showing they were getting flag not found, and they were getting error spam. And so the question is like, well, and especially it was an issue for them because in the OTel demo they're using like 4 different OpenFeature SDKs. They're using Python, C#, Java, and JavaScript, and they were all behaving differently for these same flags, right? So some were logging and some were not. And that's where we have to see this lack of standardization, I think, come across. So I think from a feature perspective, we can do a lot of things we're talking about, but we need to decide like what basic logging behavior do we even want in terms of when log statements are printed and at what level are they printed, because almost every language has abstractions for that. And how do we want to customize it and configure it if we want to make it configurable at all? And what are our defaults? I think those are all the questions I have. Thomas, did you still have something you wanted to say?
No, sorry.
Yeah, no problem. Yeah, that's really my big open question. And maybe like the first thing we do is like take some inventory. Because like Thomas says, I think we have this in some, but not all of them. And then maybe we need to decide on this, but the big question for me is like default too. Like if you're grabbing OpenFeature off the shelf and you plug in a provider and you evaluate a flag that's not there, do we expect users to see an error printed or no? Right? Like by default, what's the experience we want?
Again, in that topic, I think, for example, imagine I'm a newbie. I start to use OpenFeature, right? And then I did the misconfiguration log, because one of the useful things for configuration is for logs is also to help us developers to understand when we do some minor configuration mistakes, for example, and especially that OpenFeature uses providers that might use external resources. I think even from a user friendliness, we need to tell to the user, or in case of to the developer, that okay, this is not working because you cannot connect to server X, or because there is a misconfiguration here. That's a valid log, Now, if you want to, for example, like you mentioned, log key not found, I think that's like I don't think that is something that should be in the logs by default. I think it should be in the logs if someone wants to enable, like, let's say even not like at debug level even, because it's something very, very like the flag doesn't exist. Okay, that's fine. Like it shouldn't block the system. Should use the one default behavior, what the developer defines. It's more about the behavioral, while in terms of configuration, yes, that makes sense to shout and say, hey, you did something wrong. So that's my opinion.
I mean, that part makes sense to me. Nicholas?
Yeah, so I'm trying to figure out, like, okay, so like, yes, I'm gonna come back to it maybe, but like what kind of things could be happening in the SDK layer that is like that we need to log from there, that the provider level is not already aware of? So what are we trying to sort of like capture that the provider is not? Because then the provider could be very opinionated given it's sort of like closer knowledge to the feature flag vendor or whatever. So I think we could like push that there, but if you try to access, so the configuration part that Andre was talking about, like if you haven't set the provider and you try to, then that would be like a configuration error, and I can see why we would want to log from there. But I think like the opinionation, the stuff about like, do we want to log if the flag is actually not found? I think that could be something that the provider would be expected to have a sort of opinion about whether it should be logged and which level.
Yeah, that's not a bad point. I think to answer your question, the things that I would expect the only the SDK could handle would be, you try to evaluate a flag before your provider is ready, which is possible to do if you're kind of sidestepping some guardrails. So before your provider is initialized, you could not purposely not wait that and then try to evaluate a flag. That could be it. Your provider could be in a fatal state, which is something we allow providers to signal, and you could then try to be evaluating it. I mean, the provider at that point could still log. But those are the ones that occur to me off the top of my head. But certainly in most cases where things could go wrong, the provider would know and be able to log as well. So I think it could be a fair solution to say we don't really log anything, at least at normal info level. And maybe we'll call debug in a few places to help, but at info level we won't call, and then we'll rely on providers to kind of be more opinionated in how they log. I guess that could be a fair solution. Andre?
I think honestly now I remember the new things that are coming to the spec, and I believe this conversation will make way more sense when we have the remote protocol done, because in that way I believe I might be wrong, but we are going to communicate directly with the service, correct? And in that case, we might need to do extra logging. That's my opinion.
I mean,
Yeah, well, it's the OFREP providers, the remote providers we author, so we'd probably want to have some limited specification and logging there, I guess.
yeah, I think what we aim for is some guidelines. So probably logging could be part of the guidelines to write a OFREP provider and to say, and be opinionated, as Niklas said, that if we decide that OFREP wants to log an error for a flag not found, we can decide to do that. But yeah, it's more OFREP related than OpenFeature, I think.
Yvonne?
Yeah, I'm just maybe confused from our use case in my personal experience. In our case, we have 5 providers that we've built ourselves. We don't use FlagD or any other tool like that. And we have our own flag management system as well. And we simply use the resolution details within OpenFeature. And we have logging within our backend for sure. That's for us. But we make sure that the errors that we have there is separate from the resolution details that we send back. And within that, we have error and everything else that we pass to the providers, which then cleans up whatever we need for the SDK. I'm confused if that's not, to me, that seems like the most logical, or am I missing the mark here of something?
No, I think you've got it. I think I mean, in a system that's working well, you probably never see any logging, but I guess like the main thing I was trying to highlight is in those resolutions that the providers you've authored do, if one of them throws, in the case of Java, if you throw an exception while resolving a Boolean value, nothing is logged from the SDK. In Python, if you throw an exception, you get a log message from the SDK at error level. That's kind of one of the differences. Like basically different SDKs treat these exceptions thrown from providers differently. That's probably the biggest mismatch, I guess, across implementations, and my main concern in this discussion point. I think actually the point Nicholas made is somewhat prescient. I'm starting to believe maybe the best thing to do is just to have our SDKs maybe only log at debug level and push this responsibility down on the provider more. Yeah, I'm not sure, and it doesn't have to be something we figure out right now. I might open a small discussion on this just to capture some of the ideas from this meeting. But I mean, I'm hoping that we can come up with something that's small, like maybe a single point in the spec or a single recommendation somewhere. I don't think we need to go crazy with this, but I would like to get to a consistency across these implementations and be able to say, point at implementation and say, you're probably doing this wrong because you're logging here, or you're not. Yeah, I don't want to take up any more time on this topic, so unless there's anyone else who wants to mention something, I'll hand it off to Dominic.
Okay, just a small information. We would like to, we discussed that topic already, but now we also create a proposal to have some option to generate the flag accessors. At the moment when you are accessing the flag in OpenFeature, you need to provide the string with the name of the flag, which may be error prone. So we would like to generate some additional, let's say, layer or peer to OpenFeature API. So when you access the flag, you are sure the flag exists and was generated from some source. And for that reason, we need some very simple flag manifest when you have the type and the name of the flag. So you can then generate the accessor, which will return you the valid also type if you are in strongly typed language. So this is the beginning of that. This is just about this flag config, but eventually we would like to also give the tool so you can use that with the flag manifest to generate easily those accesses. And it should be also easy to customize for many languages, because probably we will use Golang with some templating, so it will be then easy to extend that also. But to start that work, we need those 2-3 basic fields to begin. So please take a look into the discussion. The link is in the notes, but I can also paste here in the chat.
Very cool. I mean, Mike Beamer, who's not here today, has been really interested in something like this, and even our internal teams, literally just yesterday, were mentioning they'd prefer to have something like this that was more strongly typed. Totally makes sense. Is your vision for this that like different vendors who support OpenFeature might be able to like export this configuration or something from their internal understanding of the configuration?
Yes, that's why we want to keep this format very simple, so you can easily then extract your features, feature flags from your system, and then you can just add one step in your build. So then you have access to all of them in strongly typed manner. It should enable many things. One is to avoid those problems when you are using the bad name for the flag, but also the cleanup story should be simpler, because you know when you launch the flag, and it will be easier to find the usage of it. So yeah, I think it should be easy, but with high future potential. So please take a look and add your thoughts.
This is really interesting to me. The other thing I wonder here is like, do you think that it's reasonable to use this as a basic like starting point for flag export import between providers, like a standard for that? Because it wouldn't have targeting rules, but you might have other basic metadata that would enable some of that. Do you think it's reasonable to try and handle both with some of this, or would you rather keep this completely scoped for the purposes of client generation and code generation?
So originally we were thinking about just this code generation, but of course the more metadata you have, the more power you have also for the migration. But that was not the goal. We don't want to overload that but it will be probably some simple format which will be easy to extend. Originally, we have internal system with very rich, list of attributes, but and we are generating those accessors in our internal system. So when now we want to use the OpenFeature in some of the projects, we would like to have that functionality, but the goal was not the migration between the vendors or formats.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, I'll definitely take a look at that.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, I guess that's it. Yeah, I'll follow up. I may create a poll or something for some of the conundrums we were discussing earlier about the tracking stuff, with some concrete proposals. But yeah, other than that, unless there's anybody else who wants to bring up any specific topics in the last 15 minutes, I guess that's it. Last call for additional comments or subjects.
Personally, on our side, we have some questions regarding the FLAG-D implementation. Do you know if anyone on your team is working with that directly that I could reach out to? We had a call originally a couple months ago, but
there is a dedicated Slack channel, I think, for FLAG-D. So I think that will be the best place.
Yeah, it's OpenFeature-FLAG-D.
Yep.
That's the best place to ask those questions.
Okay, I've reached out in it, but do you know if they have there's a FLAG-D meeting as well, weekly, bi-weekly, or?
There's no dedicated FLAG-D meeting. Adoption has gone up a lot recently, so I think maybe it could be something we do. I don't know if it would be like bi-weekly, but that could be something we bring up, honestly. But there's also nothing that stops us from doing one-off meetings. If there's something specific you'd like to talk about, we can put it out there to the community too, so then we can just let people know that it's going to happen. So that's also a possibility.
Perfect.
Okay. Thanks, everyone.
Great. Thanks.
Okay.